So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will continue with next presentation from Stephen Pemberton. The name may be quite hard to say about what it will be, but I think it should be about localization, XForms, or maybe something else. We will see. Enjoy.
Thank you. So, throughout the ages, whenever a new technology has been introduced, it's very often the case been that the new technology imitates the old technology in a bad way. For instance, the very first books that were printed to make them look like they were handwritten. Now, there may be a reason behind this, because manuscripts were the only books at that point, and a manuscript was very expensive. It would cost you about the equivalent of a small farm to buy a book when it was handwritten. And so maybe they wanted it to look exactly like a manuscript for that reason. But in any case, it took them quite a few years, probably about 50 years, before anybody had the bright idea, oh, let's make it more readable by using a more readable font. It doesn't have to be handwritten. Cars, similarly, when the first cars came along, they looked like horseless carriages. Now, again, there might have been a reason for this, because the only people who could make carriages were people who'd been making horses and carriages. But it's surprising how long it took them to realize that the driver didn't have to be out in the elements, and that you could put a box around the driver to protect him or her from the rain and wind. And the same thing has happened with a lot of apps. I mean, this is an app from 1997, and you can see it's an agenda program that's been made to look as much as possible like an agenda book, with that stupid stuff in the middle to make it look like a ring binder, and the little folded over page corners there. And again, they must have gone to a lot of trouble to make it exactly like a book, and there was absolutely no real reason for that. And here's yet another example of trying to make the application look as much like the thing that is replacing as possible. And the amount of work that's gone into this, that's not clear to me whether that was really worth doing. Digital watches as well. This is one from this year even, really trying to imitate a real watch as closely as possible on the screen available to it. And so when electronic forms came along, it was interesting to note that they suffered under their legacy of paper forms as well. That in the early days of web forms, a lot of managers insisted that the web form was pixel perfectly like the form it was replacing, which had the disadvantage that there are many things that you couldn't do that you would normally be able to do with an e-form that you couldn't do if it had to exactly replicate the paper version. Now, yeah, one thing that's arisen from me writing this paper is that the question arrives, well, what is actually a form? And I looked it up in several books, and one book literally said, you know it when you see it. And another said, well, it's sort of, rectangular boxes that you can fill in. But actually, I think that the essence of a form is asking for data from the user that then gets used in some way. And that, in fact, turns a lot more things into forms than you might normally consider to be a form. A dialog box is clearly a form, but when you're asked to put your location on a map, is that a form? Well, I think it really is, because all it's asking for you is for some data, and the way that you enter that data is not important, but they're still using that data. And actually, I think that this is actually a form, that this is again just asking you to fill in data that you want, and which it then uses. And the fact that it doesn't look like a form as we understand it doesn't necessarily take away from the fact that it actually is a form asking you to fill in data. So classically, forms, as we know them, are form-driven towards the data. That is, the thing that you see on the screen reflects the sort of data that they're collecting, and there's a mapping from the visible part into the underlying data. What I want to talk today is the other way round, where the data drives the form. So the form is actually dynamic, and it's the data that's coming in that has an effect on what you see. I'm going to give you three examples: one of a data-driven form for a structure, one for presentation, and one for execution. My time is short, so it's going to be very very brief. Each example is going to be brief, but I hope you'll get the idea behind it. Now, I'm going to be using XForms, surprise, surprise. I just wanted to tell you the essential bits of XForms that I'd be using in these examples. So a very essential part of XForms is the data and the controls are separated. That just like style and content is separated using CSS, the data is in one place, as it were, and the controls are in a completely different place. Now, this has a lot of advantages, just like CSS. It allows you to reuse the data in different ways. It gives you a lot more flexibility. So, for instance, you collect an instance of data, which can be from an external source, and then you bind to different parts of that data different properties. And so one example property that I'll be using a lot is relevance, that says that this data point is only relevant under certain conditions. So, for instance, in the case of a credit card number, if you're collecting that, it's only relevant if the person is having to pay by credit card, and if they're paying by cash, then there's no point in asking them for it. The controls in the user interface then binds to the data in the same way, using XPath bindings into the data instance. Okay, so just to give you an example, I'm going to zoom a bit into this. This is control. Zoom in a bit. So this is selecting the payment method, and if I say bank transfer, then I could just click on buy. But the moment I say that I'm going to buy with credit, then the credit card and expiry date immediately pop up because now they're relevant. And so I can type in a credit number. Let's see if I can. Oh yeah, that was a valid credit card number, and it's the 1802, and then I can buy. Zoom out a little bit more. So, as I said, I'm going to give 3 examples, and the first one is a classic questionnaire. Now, this is actually something that I built for ISOC Netherlands. They needed a form to be made. The actual one that we made was much more complicated, but I've brought it down to its basics here to show you the process involved. So this is the actual form. So it had one question. So it was asking people for input on improvements of the process. So it's asking them from what sort of input can you provide, and there were 3 choices, and if you chose one, then you got the questions for that choice. And if you chose another one, you got the questions for that choice, and they weren't necessarily, of course, the same set of questions. Now, as I promised, this is a multilingual form. And I'll show you how to do it shortly. These different languages that I'm about to show you just reflect my colleagues at work, so I'm afraid there's no Czech translation, but we have Italians, and we have Portuguese, and we have Chinese within the group. So this is just the same form you're now looking at, but it's just been internationalized with the messages. And if I choose a different one, then I get different values. So this is a classic form, and in the classic XForms, you'd have firstly the control to ask the question about the choice, which in this case has got 3 possible answers. And then based on the answer that you got there, then you'd have a switch that would select the bit of the user interface for that particular choice. Now, and the data would look like this. There'd be one piece of data, one set of the data for each of the possible set of answers. Now, you saw it was multilingual. That was the first thing we decided to do, and so it's just a case of taking our labels, and instead of putting this text in literally, you put a reference to an instance that contains all the messages. So this is just for one language, and if you want to switch to another language, then you just fill the instance with data from another source. But once we did this, what we realized was that each of those 3 sections in the switch were almost identical. And we realized that, in fact, we could replace that switch, which has 3 sections, which are actually longer there, but I've made it smaller so you can see it. You could replace all those 3 just by, whoops, I'm sorry, I've gone too far, just by a single group that referenced the bit of data that was going to be relevant for this one answer. And if the particular set of answers that you were going to ask for didn't have a likely element, then that control wouldn't be shown because that element wasn't there, so it would disappear. So in fact, this one single bit of control of user interface deals with all three cases in the same way and adapts to the data underneath it. So the data looks a little bit different now. I just had to change the three elements to reflect that the answer, it was an answer for which particular choice it was. But another nice advantage of this is that the form is now no longer bound to the number of answers that are bound into the user interface because it's coming from the data. So we can harvest the number of choices from the data, so that if we want to update the data, then all of a sudden it gives us the chance of, oh, I've gone too far now, sorry. It gives us the chance to add new data into our underlying data, and all of a sudden the form works with these new choices without you having to change the form at all. All you had to do is add this extra bit of data and the extra messages to match it, and all of a sudden the form it now treats that option as well. So this is great for content providers, of course, because it means that they don't have to change anything in the form itself. They can just change the data that drives that form. It makes it very much easier then to add new answers or to update the text or add new translations. Okay, my second example is I'm going to zoom a little bit out. Yeah, okay, so CSS presentation mode, which I've been using for years, is a great part of CSS that allows you to say that if you're going into projection mode, then use this set of CSS rules. This is great because it means that you can repurpose your content in lots of ways. So the screen goes into full screen mode, and then these new rules come into play so that you can make the font larger and do whatever you want. So the content's easily repurposable. It gives you the choice of editing software for your HTML. It's platform independent. It gives you lots of control, and it also guarantees a long life for your content because you're not bound to a piece of proprietary software which might die at some point or another. Unfortunately, CSS projection mode is now no longer supported by any browser. Opera was actually the only one that ever did it, and they've stopped supporting it now. And so now we're forced to move over to one of the JavaScript packages for displaying stuff on the screen. And there are dozens of them, really. I mean, so reveal, remark, web slides, deck, shower, it goes on and on and on. But the problem with using these is they're not standardized, so you can't switch one out and switch the other one in because they've got different formats for their files. It's hard to repurpose your content because you have to actually edit the file to get it on the screen. And of course, if support for the package disappears, which I should say has already happened with at least one package, then you're in trouble. It's just like using proprietary software again. So I did try using some of these packages, and I didn't like it. And so what was the answer for me? Well, of course, a data-driven form. Now, what I'm going to show you is how that works. It's actually very easy. It's a surprisingly small amount of code. It allows the continued use and repurposing of your existing content without change, and it continues to give you the power of HTML and CSS. So here's how you do it. You have an instance where you get your slides from. That's, in my case, that's an XHTML file, so I just get it from over the web. And then I make a single binding that says how to identify a single slide. In this case, within the body, I've just got a series of divs. And the one that I want, I have a single instance that contains an integer that says which slide I want to look at. Now, I don't have to demonstrate this program to you because that's actually what I'm using now. You're now looking at XForms displaying slides on the screen. So if I want to display a single slide, all I have to do is bind in the user interface to that one slide in a group, and then do the following. So I could put a control to choose which slide I want, and in fact I do have that up in the corner there to go to the next and the previous, but of course you want to be able to use a remote, and the remotes actually just work like a keyboard that sends one of two characters, either page up or page down. So all I do is catch the key down for page up or arrow left if I'm doing it from my keyboard, and then I just increment or decrement that one integer, and that then goes on to the next slide, like this. So you can see the integer number up there, page number 30 of 43, and if I click on page down, then it goes up to 31 of 43, because all I've done is incremented one integer, and then that's given me the next slide. Now, to show one slide, I just repeat over all the elements within that one slide. So that's just a bunch of HTML elements. I've got a number of outputs here that are bound to an H1, an H2, a P, and so on. But of course, only one of those is going to match, so only one of those controls is actually going to show up for that particular element. So I just go over all the elements, and all those elements get displayed. And of course, I use CSS there by doing a class that says how I want H1s to be shown or H2s to be shown. So one slide there is an H2, and so I've made it bigger and page wide and bold and yellow background. A more complicated case is where you've got an element that's got mixed content, like a P, but luckily there's an XPath selector for that, a node which then selects all the nodes within the element. And so if it's just a text, then I just output that text with a class for that, and so on for EM, strong, code, A, image, and so on. So this is not a perfect replacement for CSS projection mode, but it still has all those advantages. My content is still repurposable without editing. I still have my choice of editing software. It's platform independent. It gives me a lot of control. My content has a long life, and it's only 100 lines of XForms, and that's compared with, well, I just took one of them, shower, which is almost 10,000 lines of code, of JavaScript code, to do more or less the same thing. It's a bit fancier, but frankly, it's not worth the difference. So in other words, it's very, very easy. My last example is the XForms 2 test suite. Now, XForms 1 and 1.1 have a test suite as well, but it's just hundreds of separate files which you have to one by one click on and run. So this is just an example of one of them, which just tests that max returns not a number in certain cases. So it's a pain to write new tests, and it's a pain to add them to the test suite, and it's a pain to have to run them all one by one. So of course, the XForms 2 test suite is now a self-testing, data-driven XForm. So you're now looking at it in real life. It's a work in progress, but let's go down to, for instance, functions, and oh no, I don't want data types, I want functions. And so if I start from the first one there, now I've run that test, it's passed, Boolean from string, and then I can go to the next one, not function, that's passed, is card number, average, min, max, count on empty, oh, index has failed. So you can see how it's working. So the whole framework is an XForm that's loading these things in, but so it's a data-driven XForm. But the nice thing is also that the individual tests are also data-driven forms. So, for instance, this one case, this is not an image, this is actually running, having been run there. This one case, for instance, for comparing two strings, I'll show you how that works. So what we want to do is to be able to test that something like compare apple and orange returns the result that's expected from it. So what we do is enclose that in an element called test. And then within that element, we mark the two parameters of compare that we want to compare. Then on the test element, we add attributes for the required result. So in this case, we want it to return -1, and the result that's actually going to be calculated shortly, and then whether this test has passed. Now, we collect hundreds of these together in an instance, which we call tests. We give it a name, we give it a description if we want, and we have a top-level attribute which says whether all the tests have passed. Now, we just have to add bindings to this instance. The top one is the only one that changes per file, and that says that the result for the test is a calculation of a compare of the A and the B parameters. Then we can test whether that test has passed by seeing whether the result and the required attributes are the same. If they are, then it's passed. And then we can test whether the whole test set is passed by seeing if we can find an example of a test where a pass isn't yes. And if we can't, then it's passed, and if we can, then it's failed. What this means is that the actual body, the user interface of the test, of the series of tests, is identical for every single group of tests, for every single function that we're testing. Because all we have to do is output the name, which was in the instance. We output the description if it's there, which is again also in the instance. We output whether the test suite has passed on this set of tests. And then each test we go over one by one, outputting what we were expecting, what we were getting, and if they're different, with a big red error message saying that it's failed. So what this gives us is a lot of flexibility, because it's now very, very easy to add new tests. It's very, very easy to run the tests. It's still work in progress. We're only about halfway through, but it's made our life in the working group very much easier. XForms 2 is a work in progress as well, but in order to support data-driven forms, XForms 2 has got new features within the model that make it even easier to do. So if you're interested, you can check out the XForms 2 spec at that location. So in conclusion, the comparison of style and content was not accidental. It really is very similar and has lots of similar advantages. Data-driven forms adds a new level of abstraction, and the way that I like to illustrate this is, imagine a publisher's contract with an author. That thing can have content and it can have styling, but also, as far as the publisher is interests, the only thing that's changing there is the name of the person and the royalty rate that they're getting. So there are several layers of content as well as the presentation. You've got the content, but the content has layers as well. And data-driven forms also then allows you to abstract that layer out of your content, which has the effect of actually blurring the distinction between a form and an application. But it gives you a lot of power. It allows you to specify what you would normally think of as a procedural application. It allows you to specify it entirely declaratively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And we have time for questions. Over there from Abel. I will go there. Fresh.
Thank you for this presentation. You may have turned me into an XForms enthusiast, and that hasn't happened before. So that's I think a very good thing. I do have one question, that is, how is this driven? As in, do you end up having a client-side XForms processor, or is it implemented in some application? How does that go?
XForms was designed to work both client-side as server-side, and within the working group we have representatives of both methods of implementation. But all this is just pure XForms. There was nothing non-XForms in these examples, it's all, in this case, it's all running in the client. So it's all running on my machine. Everything that happened just then happened on my machine. I didn't go to any server for any of that.
You're saying the browser understands the XForms, or do you require some JavaScript front-end library?
It's XSLT forms, so you put your XForms in there with a single PI at the top, just saying that it's XSLT, and here's where you get the style sheet, and the rest happens like magic.
Sounds beautiful.
It is beautiful.
Very beautiful. So do we have some more questions? Probably no. So thank you again, Stephen.
All right, thank you.